the official definition that I have, it's kind of combining all of those things that we talked about into one big definition. So child development as a field studies how and why children grow, develop, and learn, typically from conception to adolescence. So we usually kind of classify it right there, but the lines can get kind of blurry when it comes to where we start becoming a child and where we are not a child anymore. So we will be talking about, adulthood. We won't really, sometimes when I put like specific ages on there, just know that a lot of those are pretty soft since, again, psychology and this sort of field, we can't really put exact numbers on things because we all develop at a different pace. So we can't really say a different age, like a definitive age on different stages of life because everyone is different. Okay, so to start off, here are just some kind of basic principles of development as just like as a subject. So the first thing is that development is lifelong. We don't necessarily stop developing at any given point in time. Throughout our lives, we continue to grow and change as individuals. We can see that change throughout our lifespan. And although we're only going to be really focusing on development and the ways that we develop as a child, just keep in mind that adolescence isn't just like the end and you don't stop growing from there. We still do continue to grow. The next thing is that early experiences affect later development. If you've ever heard ideas of like things that happen to you as a kid have lifelong impacts on you in the future, that's basically what this is talking about. So things that happen to you earlier in your life can have sort of snowball effects on what happens later in your life. Next, development is multi-directional. So that basically means that we can grow in some areas and then we lose in other areas. So maybe if we start to maybe develop more like mentally, cognitively, maybe we'll lose something physically, or we won't do as much growing in certain areas. So the idea that we can grow in different ways and we don't have to always grow at the same amount in every single aspect of development, that's basically what that means. The next thing, development is multi-dimensional. So we basically have different ways of classifying our development. There are different ones, and that's on the next slide. I'll share how we generally classify these different dimensions or domains of development. But yeah, so there are multiple different paths or multiple different like areas that we develop. Next, development is characterized by plasticity. So plasticity is a cool neuroscience psychology term that is meant to show that our brains have the capacity to change. We can make new pathways in our brains when we learn new skills. Our brains we're able to completely change how we think of things, how we approach things. And that sort of cool malleability in how our brains develop is really important for our development. Because if our brains couldn't change at all, well, then we won't be able to change either. So there wouldn't be any development without plasticity. And then last but not least, development is multi-contextual. So what that basically means is that we can sort of take our development and have different ways that influence, different things that influence the way we develop. We can have our genetics, the genes that we get from our parents, the environment that we grew up in, where we live, the actions, beliefs, and cultures that are surrounding us, our families, all of that stuff. So there's just so many different aspects that impact our development. And the goal here is to kind of see how all of these ideas fit into the bigger picture of how we develop as people. And I see a question about putting the slides in the chat. I'll do it at the very end so that I don't have to stop the presentation and deal with technology a little bit. But yes, I will share the slides with you guys. You guys will get to see these. Okay, so as I mentioned a little bit ago, these are the 3 different ways that we kind of split up development. So the first is our physical development. This is probably the one that you can really see most visibly, the way that we change physically throughout our lives. So it could be things like our height or our weight, our motor skills, our sensory abilities, and then just our general bodily functions. It could be things like different hormones and different ways that we grow and change, our immunity, even the ways that our brains change and develop can kind of fall under physical development. Next is cognitive development. So this is very brain focused. It looks at our intelligence and our perception. The language is a really big one, how we learn to communicate with the world, how we learn to understand what's going on around us, our memories, and then our problem solving skills. So our cognitive development is probably the one that takes the longest to develop. We don't really stop developing cognitively until well past official adulthood, and we continue to change cognitively throughout our lives. The last one is our social and emotional development. So obviously that one's pretty obvious what it's talking about, but the ways that our emotions change, the different ways that we learn to perceive ourselves, and our interpersonal relationships. So how we connect with other people, like our families and our friends and people that we grow up around and people that we see every day, classmates, all of that stuff. So those are the three different really areas of development that we kind of split up this whole thing into. And we'll be able to talk about each of these in particular in every different stage of life, because there are changes in each one of these domains throughout our lives as we grow. Okay, so next are periods of development. Now, again, these age ranges are pretty soft since we're all very different. We all have different aspects that affect our development. So we can't really put specific numbers on here's where you go from this stage to the next stage, because that wouldn't make a lot of sense. We're all very different people and we all mature at a different rate. So these ages are kind of general ages, but don't take them as like specific hard fact, as these are very like clear cut. They're really kind of fuzzy barriers, I guess. So the first is prenatal development. So this would be before birth. So when we are in the womb, we do actually develop a lot in the womb. There's a lot of really cool stuff that happens, which I'm really excited to share. That'll be what we talk about next week. We'll go into a lot of detail with our prenatal development and how even before we're born and experiencing the world, there's still a lot of changes that we go through so that we can get ready to experience the world. And then next would be infancy and toddlerhood. These would be our very first years of life. So right after we're born to 2 years, you might think that this stage is really boring because like babies literally do like nothing but eat and sleep and cry. So you might think that it's really boring, but there are actually some really cool things that we are able to do as infants that kind of are like leftovers from our past that helped us to survive and live in a world that was a lot harsher than the world that we live in now. So there's a lot of really cool little things that we have as infants and as toddlers. So we actually do a little bit more than just eating, sleeping, pooping, and crying. There's some cool stuff there. Next would be early childhood, so from ages 3 to 5 about. So these would kind of be like our preschool years. It's where we kind of start learning how to communicate. We start using words, and then we're learning language. We start becoming a little bit more independent, and we start kind of understanding how the world works as a whole. So that's early childhood. Next is middle childhood. So middle childhood is about ages 6 through 11. That's kind of when we start our early grades of school. So we start testing our academic skills. We start making new connections with people and our peers. We start, connecting with people, and that's kind of where things go from just like learning how to survive to going into school, and our intellectual development begins to grow. That's a big one in middle childhood. And then last but not least, we have adolescence. So adolescence is kind of the last stage that we're going to focus on, usually from about age 12 until adulthood. So that is when we start going into that phase of kind of child becoming an adult. It's this sort of middle stage. It's a very dramatic physical change. there's a lot of pretty crazy stuff that happens there. It's kind of where we start thinking about more abstract ideas, I guess. So we start seeing, like, we start thinking of the world in a more complex way than in previous years. So usually, I guess adolescence is the stage that I'm in right now. And there's still some really, obviously, there's a lot of physical changes that happen in adolescence, but there's still a lot of stuff going on there. But typically, adolescence is where we kind of stop considering ourselves a child. So I'm not going to put too much focus on it because, this is a focus on child development, and adolescence is kind of hitting that barrier. Early childhood. All right. Okay, so those are our periods of development. So after today, we're going to have 5 weeks left of this class, and there are 5 periods that I've split this into. So we're going to be focusing on each one of these periods every week. So that's pretty cool. Okay, sorry, my slides is just not. Okay, there we go. So there are a lot of words on this slide. Don't worry, I'll break it down for you. So next, we're going to be talking about some little debates that we have in the world of developmentalists, because there are some arguments on how development works and the different theories behind it. So the first one is nature versus nurture, which I'm sure many of you have probably heard about. So the big idea with nature versus nurture is, do our genetics have the biggest impact on like how we grow up, or is it more our environment and the place that we grow up? So I guess for each one of these, what do you guys think? Do you think our the way that we grow up, do you think that that's more genetics, or do you think that's more affected by our environment? So I see Lily thinks that it's nurture. Why do you think that it's nurture and not nature? And anyone can answer if they also agree, Lily, that it is nurture. Yeah, it's kind of, yep. So I see, I think it's Ira, right? If I pronounce your name wrong, I'm so sorry.
It's Ira, like Einstein.
Okay, so yeah, so she said both, which is a really good point. And that's generally what psychologists agree with. There's a lot of different arguments over whether it's more nature or more nurture, but I guess the real answer is that it kind of depends. Some things have more of a genetic aspect and some things have more of an environmental aspect, but the interplay between the two is the big idea. Next is continuity versus discontinuity. So the idea behind this is, do you think that we have specific stages that we go through when we develop, or is it just a very gradual, kind of smooth process? So some people think that we have these distinct, different stages of development where, if we're in this stage, then all of this stuff happens, and then we move on to the next stage and all of this stuff happens. And then some people think that it's very gradual. So it's kind of like we kind of flow through different phases of development. So maybe it's more of like a gradual process of going from infant to adult, or whether it's very concrete different stages. Yeah, so blurry stages is a really good way to put it. I think that's probably where I would stand. So I feel like that there are stages, but they're just not, they're not exactly like specific. So so we have a poll that I can put up for you guys if you don't want to like share your opinions in the chat, which is totally fine. I get that typing is long. So I will go ahead and open up a poll for you guys to take a peek at. And you guys can vote on whether you think it's continuity or whether it's discontinuity. And if you think it's both, that's okay. Just pick one that you feel like would be more closer to what you think it would be. So feel free to answer that. So I'll give it a couple minutes and then I'll go ahead and share the results so you guys can see what everyone else thought too. Okay, I'll give it a few more seconds for you to decide and then I'll close the poll. Okay, I'm gonna stop polling now. Okay, so it looks like most of you thought continuity rather than discontinuity. So you kind of saw it as more of a gradual approach, which is definitely true. I don't think it's really a good idea to say that like we have these like specific, like we only go from like this stage to this stage to this stage. I think there's definitely a lot of blurred lines in the middle, and we can maybe be like halfway in one stage or halfway in another stage. So I definitely agree with you guys that I think it's very continuous. I don't think we can say that it's like discrete points in our lives. I think I definitely agree that it's very kind of linked, connected. Okay, so the last developmental debate that I'll talk about is active versus passive. So this is basically looking at how much of a role do we play in our own development. So we've already established that we have like our genetics, our environment, and all these factors around us that affect our development. But how much do you think we have an impact on the way that we grow? Can we change how we develop, or is it more of like we kind of like have all these aspects around us that influence us, but we can't really do much about that? Do you think we can move beyond those and change our developmental path, or do you think it's just everyone else? So there's another poll for this one too. So I will go ahead and watch that. So feel free to vote on this one, and then once we're done with that, we can maybe talk about it a bit more in the chat. Yeah, I think we have, all right. And then again, I'll give it maybe like 30 more seconds for you guys to decide. And then we will go ahead and discuss. Okay, so I will stop the poll and then okay, it's giving me an error. 1 second. Okay, so yeah, so I see that Lily said that she said passive, but more and more active as you get older, which I definitely understand too. But okay, I think we're having a little bit of an issue sharing the poll results, but I will say that we were kind of split 60-30, with more people thinking active rather than passive. So for those who answered active, does anyone want to share why they think it's more of an active idea, that we have a bigger influence in our development? So why do you guys think that it is that way? Yeah, so there's the breakdown in the chat of what our poll results were. So again, for those who said active, or if you said passive, why do you think it's one way or the other? And there's no like right or wrong answer for this. Like I said, these are debates that psychologists today are still arguing about and still kind of balancing and trying to figure out. So anything that you say could be a possibility. There's not a right or a wrong answer on this. Both of them have valid arguments. So yeah. So Angelina, I know it looks like you said that it was active. Do you want to share why you think it's active? Or yeah, this is a tough one. All of these debates are pretty tough because again, you can argue both sides. So okay, I see Amanda shared something in the chat. We're more active with our development when we are not, because you don't rely on other things as much for ourselves. So yeah, I see what you're saying. So we I think that it's especially important as we get a little bit older. So really we have our own way of exploring and learning about the world. So we don't really need to have other people and other factors influence us. I definitely understand where you're coming from. I'm sure we play some role in our own development. But yeah, so different psychologists have different theories and different ideas for which one of these sides of each debate that they land on. So there's different theories for every side. Some people think that it's very much nature oriented. Some people think that it's a lot of nurture. Some people really focus and hone in on different stages. Some people have a more gradual idea of our development. Some people focus a lot on how we can dynamically affect our development. Then other people say that there isn't really much that we can do with our own development. Everyone has a different idea, and it's kind of about taking all those ideas and kind of fitting them together to see what the bigger picture is. And again, we don't know if one is right or more right than the other one. It all depends. Okay, so next, we're just going to go through a couple different theories of development. Like I mentioned, there are lots of different psychologists that have contributed to these different debates and try to understand how exactly our development works and how we can classify our development and describe our development as children. So one of the most famous developmental theories is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Piaget was this really cool French guy. I believe this came from him looking at the IQs and testing IQs of different children. And he started noticing that kids in different age groups were making the same exact mistakes on these tests. So he decided to look more into why there are these patterns, and he came up with the conclusion that children of differing ages interpret the world differently. Now, that might seem obvious for us right now, but when Piaget was first coming up with this research, this was really cool because people thought that kids just kind of like learned and just like developed like very gradually, but he realized that there's kind of these like different stages or different like milestones that you can go through. And he's someone that argues a lot about the discontinuity idea. He thinks that there are, specific stages that we develop, and I'll go into those stages on the next slide. But these are kind of like some of these main ideas with Piaget. So his theory focuses on the idea of equilibrium, which equilibrium is a concept you'll hear a lot in science. It comes up in a lot of different places. But in this circumstance. Equilibrium refers to the idea of, as children, we grow up trying to balance what we see and perceive in the world. We're trying to balance that with what we already know. So we're taking in new information and we're trying to process it and fit it into our idea of the world. So that's kind of going to the next little vocab term, is a schema. So a schema, you can kind of think of them as inside of your brains. You have all of these different boxes of stuff that we know. And in this case, these schemas are boxes of knowledge. So maybe you have a schema for dogs. So whenever you go out into the world and you see, a little furry thing walking around on a leash, you think of it as a dog. So we have, and not every dog looks the exact same, but we know that they're all dogs. So that's kind of what a schema is. So we have different schemas for different concepts and ideas in our world. So it could be things like dogs, it could be things like food, or what are some other categories that you can think of? Just share as many as you can in the chat. What do you think are some of examples of schemas? I said dogs, and then I said food. What are some other ones that you guys can think of? Personalities, that's a good one. We can see different moods and feelings, and we can classify those. What else? And these don't have to be as complicated as personalities. They can be super simple things. Schedules, that's another good one. Again, you don't really have to go very in depth with this. Just think of basic stuff that we learn as kids. Could it be like colors? That could be a schema. We have different colors that we see in the world. Words, letters, languages. If you're someone that grows up learning multiple languages, we have a different box for one language and a different box for another language. Different kinds of animals. I mentioned dogs, but that could go for any animal, really. Dogs is just a really good one because dogs are cool. You could say cats, turtles, war. I suppose that's something that I guess younger kids wouldn't really be thinking of, but that's a possibility. Stuff that you learn at school, different subjects. We probably have a schema for math and a schema for reading and science and social studies and music. Okay. So there's lots of different schemas for stuff that we can come up with. And then the way that we take these schemas and we organize them are, we have two different ways of doing that. So the first one is called assimilation. So assimilation is basically when we see something new in the world and we just fit it into another schema that we already have. So maybe your, little 2-year-old you is, in the park with your family, and you see what we know as a dog, but you've never seen a dog that looks like that. But maybe you can take a look at it, you can think about it and see this is similar. It looks kind of like other dogs that I've seen. So maybe this is also a dog. And then you look at it and say dog. So that would be assimilation. You're taking something that you see and you're adding it to a box that you already know. Now, accommodation, on the other hand, is when we take in something that we see, and then that ends up changing the boxes and our structure of how we organize everything in our brain. So maybe instead of seeing a dog when you're in the park with your family, you see a cat. Well, your first try, you might go and look at it and you might call it a dog because you don't know any better. It's not like you've seen a cat before. But then maybe someone like a family member will be like, no, that's actually a cat. So then you have a new box now for cats. Yeah, so Lily's saying that when she was a toddler, she went to the zoo and she thought everything was a dog. So that's actually a really common thing for kids to do because maybe they've only seen 1 or 2 animals in their lives. Yeah, a lot of people did that. I think I did the same thing, except the opposite. I did it with cats. Instead, I thought everything was a cat. because I had a cat. I didn't really have a cat when I was younger, but I knew about cats before I knew about dogs. Anyways, yeah, so that's something really common. And then it's up to maybe our parents or our guardians to come over and tell us that not everything that's brown and furry is a dog. Everything's turtles. That's another possibility. So then we start making new boxes and we start reorganizing our boxes and we start continuing to development, growth. Very cool. So those are some 4 ideas that are involved with Piaget's theory. Yep, everything, they were too fast to be turtles. Turtles are kind of slow. Okay, so as I mentioned, Piaget kind of split everything into, everything is monkeys. That's a funny one. Wow, monkeys. I actually haven't heard of that one before. That's interesting. I mean, she'll grow out of it, I'm sure. You know, she'll learn to accommodate, I suppose, applying knowledge that you're learning here. So going back to what we were doing, Piaget kind of split child development into 4 different stages. And again, Piaget thought that these stages were really concrete, but we know that that may not actually be the case. So the first one is the sensory motor stage. So our sensory motor stage is, you can kind of see in the word itself, we have sense and motor for movement. So this is around from birth to age 2, where you don't really do a lot other than take in the world through what we see. That's why babies put everything in their mouths, because that's the only way that they can understand the world around them, through their senses and through movement. So, you know, you'll see babies, they'll look at stuff, they'll touch stuff, they'll smell things, they'll eat things, you know, all of that stuff. That's just how they explore the world. And that's the only thing that they can really do to start perceiving the world and understanding how the world around them works, because they can't exactly talk. And then through movement as well, babies, they start, you know, usually you kind of just lay on your back and do stuff, and then you roll over, and then you start crawling and walking. So we learn a lot that way before even language begins to become an idea for us. Before we can really communicate verbally with the world, we communicate physically through our senses. So the next stage is the pre-operational stage. So this is where we start introducing, oh yeah, you as a baby, you never ate paper and stuff like that. Well, that's good. I tended to put a lot of toys and stuff in my mouth. I really liked bright colors as a kid, you know, like big, like colorful toys. I like stuffed animals a lot. I used to do a lot with them. We'll probably be talking a lot about our childhood experiences in this class, because it's a really fun way to see how, as kids, all of these ideas and all these concepts actually tap into us. We were all kids at one point. So if you look back, you can ask your parents and things like that, if they have any stories from when you were a kid of all the things that we learned about. So yeah. Your sister put everything in her mouth when she was a baby. My sister did that too. All right, so the next stage is the pre-operational stage. And this is usually from around ages 2 through 7. So this is when language and communication through language really starts to develop. So that's when we start speaking, we start communicating, we start, you know, being able to share our thoughts and ideas with the world, instead of just crying or throwing a tantrum, even though I'm sure 2 to 7-year-olds still cry and throw tantrums. The thing is that the reason we call this the pre-operational stage is that sometimes common sense and logic aren't entirely there just yet. So kids from ages 2 through 7, they might still have like a fear of the dark, for example, because they just don't know what's out there. Their imaginations are running wild, and they don't know any better because they're little kids. So this is called the pre-operational stage, because you're not really hitting that point of logic and common sense and reasoning just yet. So the next stage is the concrete operational stage. So this is where logical thinking finally comes in. Yeah, and if you're still afraid of the dark, that's totally fine. I'm not saying that you're the equivalent of a 7-year-old or anything like that. Again, development is very different depending on who you are, and sometimes, and I actually still have fears too. It's not like every single fear is one that we grow out of. So, yeah. And then the concrete operational stage again is the logical thinking phase. That's when we start really kind of seeing the common sense of the world. That's usually when you start growing out of a lot of those childhood fears. Like you won't like completely scream and cry. Like some kids are afraid of like the drain in the bathtub because it's like scary because you don't know what's down there and it's dark and they don't want to get sucked in. Like when I was a kid, I was always scared that I would get sucked up by the vacuum cleaner, even though I know that that makes zero sense whatsoever. It's not like the vacuum cleaner could suck me up. But again, I was in the pre-operational stage. I didn't know better. But then once you kind of hit that concrete operational stage, that's when you start kind of seeing logic. And yeah, the Santa and the Tooth Fairy, that's concrete operational stage is when you start kind of moving on from those really like fairy tale ideas. Like younger kids might say that they want to be like a princess or I guess there were some kids when I was little that said that they wanted to be a dinosaur when they grow up. So silly stuff like that is stuff that starts going away in the concrete operational stage of development. And then the last stage is the formal operational stage. So the formal operational stage is when we hit this point of like abstract thinking. So we can start kind of imagining like more complicated concepts in the world, and we have a little bit more maturity to think about more confusing or difficult concepts to understand. So that's the formal operational stage. It's usually when you're 12 or older, kind of hitting that middle school adolescence time is when we start reaching that abstract thinking phase. But yeah, so these are Piaget's 4 stages that he came up with for development. One of the big problems with this one is that he was very concrete about them, which isn't really a great idea to do because, again, development is very different based on where you grew up and your culture, and those stages aren't as like hard bound as Piaget thought they were. Okay, so another theory of development is Erik Erikson's. I know that's a really fun name. And he came up with the psychosocial theory of development. So we think of Erik Erikson as sort of the father of developmental psychology. His model pretty much gives us a guideline for the entire lifespan. If you guys have heard of Freud, he was a pretty big psychologist. Erikson was one of his students, and he kind of elaborated and had his own view on Freud's ideas because Freud kind of had some interesting thoughts, which weren't exactly true, but that's beside the point. For Erikson's model really emphasizes the impact of culture and relationships and society as a whole on our development as we grow. So these are Erik Erikson. He split up development into 8 different stages, starting from when we're born and then actually all the way to the end of our lives. So the first stage we have is trust versus mistrust. This is when we're infants. Basically, we need to have our needs met, like our physical survival needs. We need to have those met consistently. That's our big like conflict. Like we need that. And if we don't get that, that's a problem. From ages 1 through 2, we hit this phase of autonomy versus shame and doubt. So ages 1 and 2 is when we start walking. So we have this new freedom that we really want to do and we really want to be independent, but then we still have to understand that we can't just be adults at age 1. That's a big realization that we have to experience. Ages 3 to 5 is initiative versus guilt. So that's when you really start hitting that independence thing. Like 3 to 5-year-olds want to do everything by themselves. They don't want any help from anybody. But then they need to realize that And then they feel really bad when they make mistakes and they can't do stuff on their own, which is really hard to deal with when you're a kindergartner. So that's the big idea with that stage. And then from 6 through 11, kind of like start of school, industry versus inferiority. So that's when we start focusing on our accomplishments. We want to be able to do cool things and brag about all of the amazing things that we do. And we kind of start comparing ourselves to other people, and we start kind of focusing on our peers more and how we compare with our peers. And then adolescence, we go through something called identity versus role confusion. Because adolescence is when we're trying to figure out who we are as people as we're growing into adulthood. And then next, intimacy versus isolation. That's young adulthood. That's when we start, trying to want to find people to be with, and we want, maybe start a family in the future. That's that stage. And then generativity versus stagnation. That's when we start hitting like work and, providing for families and stuff like that. And then integrity versus despair is the last stage of our life, when we start looking back on what we've done throughout our lives. And are we proud of what we've done? Are we happy? Or do we wish we had done more? So those are the 8 stages that Erik Erikson came up with. So that's basically his theory on development. He had a very long-term theory. He went from, when we're kids to all the way to the end of our lives. Okay, the last theory that we're going to talk about, I know we don't have a lot of time left, is Yuri Bronfenbrenner. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name right. He had an idea called the ecological systems model. Now, this is the most comprehensive theory of development that I have to share with you guys today. So he looked at Piaget, he looked at Erikson, he looked at Freud, he looked at all of these developmental psychologists, and he took all of their ideas and he put them into one theory. And basically, it explains the influences that we have on our development. And I think there's a typo here, but the direct influences and the indirect influences, because there are so many aspects that can affect our development. So here is a little diagram to show what his model looked like. So in the middle, we have, do I have a laser pointer? I do have a laser pointer. That's cool. Okay, so in the middle, we have the developing child. So these are things about us that we have that affect our development, or this is just our development in itself. And then closest to us, we have our microsystem. So these are stuff that is very close to us. Things like our family, our school, our neighborhood, our friends, maybe like our religious community, stuff like that. All of these things affect us directly, and then we also affect them. And then the mesosystem is basically how our microsystems interact with each other. So our home and our school, how does that connect? School and neighborhood, our peer group in our neighborhood, and our peer group in our religion. It kind of takes those things and it shows how they connect to each other. And then the exosystem is all of the influences on our mesosystem and our microsystem. So this could be things like our community, our government agencies, like media, social media, like friends of our parents, and people outside of our little group. This educational system as a whole, like what curriculum are you going through? What is going on in the world at that time? And then the macro system is like the big picture. So we've got like the economic and political structure of wherever we're growing up, like the culture of our country or the area that we're in. And then finally, we have the chrono system, which is down here. So that's basically just taking all of this and how it changes over time. So it's all of these systems over an extended period of time, which is a lot. It's pretty cool to think about how stuff that's so far away, like you wouldn't think that like who's running for president would have any impact on our development as children, but it really does, because it has an impact on all of these other things that in turn affect our development, which is pretty cool. So that is Bronfenbrenner's model for development. Okay, so that was a lot. We went through a bunch of stuff today. Again, I'll share the slides with you guys. You don't have to like memorize this stuff or whatever. This is a lot of information, I know. So just to review, we talked about what is child development as a field, what it studies, what we do, and then we talked about different principles of development, these sort of main ideas that we have when we talk about development, different domains of development, that's like physical, cognitive, emotional, social development. We have these different areas that we divide our development into. And then periods of development, those are kind of the different stages that we generally classify our development into as we pass through these different stages. Different developmental debates like nature versus nurture, continuity versus discontinuity, and then active versus passive. And then we got into theories of development. So we talked about Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So he had this idea of like schemas and equilibrium, how we take in new information and sort of balance that with what we already know. And then we talked about Erikson. He had this model for how we develop throughout our entire life and what are the big conflicts that we deal with at every stage of life. And then Bronfenbrenner, he was looking at the different influences that we have onto our development. So that is our first day of child development. I know